Yeah.
Alright, I'll wait for Charlie.
No, get started. I need some refreshment.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming, such as you are. We are collectively part of the Chainsaw Buffet podcast, where we talk about whatever the hell we feel like, basically random pieces of pop culture, nerd, anime, video games, whatever we feel like talking about. So today we're here to talk about nonfiction for geeks. I'm sorry, we'll try and speak up as best we can, but like I said, Mortal Kombat is like going next door. And,
that breaks the wall, the Mortal Kombat and the Tekken.
Yeah. So, I need to go run some scrubs off the machines, and that way it'll be quiet. But, I guess we'll quickly introduce ourselves, and then I'll hand it off to Dylan, since he's kind of the guy who masterminded this panel. I'm John. I have stolen the title of head of podcast planning from Chainsaw Buffet, which means I'm usually the guy that sends out emails and requests interviews and sets up when we're going to record everything. So that's basically what I do and who I am. So,
Charlie, these are really good. Emerald breakfast on the go. It's got nuts and granola. You don't say. I do.
You know he does the voiceovers for those pistachio commercials.
Yeah.
Liam O'Brien, voice actor extraordinaire. Former interview guest from the Chainsaw Buffet podcast. Not that out there, we're shamelessly name dropping the panel. Yes.
I'm Dylan, and I do tech for the podcast, a little bit of everything else. So, basically the reason we put together this panel is Charlie and I tend to read, I don't tend to read a lot of fiction, but we tend to read a lot of non-fiction books, and we'll talk and compare notes and things like that. So this is kind of going to be a that guy panel where we all get up here and talk about stuff that we like. And so if you guys have something to add in, by all means, say this
Yeah, we're pretty chill, and there's like 9 of us in the whole room, so yes, it's fine.
One thing I would say before we start,
No flash your dog.
One thing that helped me organize this panel is there's a site called Goodreads, goodreads.com. Yeah, and I just mark whenever I finish a book, so I can go back through that list and like, yeah, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that. Otherwise, it has to dig for a bookshelf. But I'm going to let these guys start since I have like a huge list of notes. I'm going to be the guy who consumes all that.
Charlie, do you want to start? Paper, rock, scissors. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, go for it.
Alright. What should I start with? Wherever you want. It's
your show now.
And if you mention anything I've got on my list,
I'll start with something that we both read. Freakonomics. This one's really fun, actually. It's better. Any of you read Freakonomics? Oh man, I'm surprised about that. Okay, cool.
there is a movie that they
yes.
did. It's on Netflix streaming. It covers the same stuff that one does.
This is basically, it's an economist and a journalist, and they're applying the toolbox of economics to questions that you wouldn't assume an economist would tackle. And it's by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner. But just some of the, let's see if I can find the chapter headings are like, what do school teachers and sumo wrestlers have in common? How is the Ku Klux Klan like a group of real estate agents? Why do drug dealers still live with their moms? Where have all the criminals gone? What makes the perfect parent? And Perfect Parenting Part 2, or would a Rashonda by any other name smell as sweet? And let's see, what you got on that?
It's interesting. You say they kind of apply the economic toolbox to it, but they do so in ways that aren't immediately obvious. They talk about incentives and punishments as ways to drive behavior.
Yeah, that's really like the big theme, I think, is how people respond to different incentives, whether positive or negative. And it's not a special. It's really not a technical book at all. I mean, they do go over.
We're not economists.
No, they go over. I mean, they mention some economic principles, but they don't. Even though the guy, I think, the economist is actually a professor at the University of Chicago. He's not. I never felt he was talking down. He was talking down.
No, it's.
But he's not. He's not up on. He's not.
It's not an
teaching
economics
class.
It's a kind of book of interest and trivia. The funny thing is, all these incentives and punishments don't work the way people think they work, or a lot of them. They don't. And what's interesting is they get into some touchy issues, but they're very much apolitical. So,
Like one of my favorites was the why do drug dealers still live with their moms? They did research using what was the guy's name?
I don't remember.
He was an Indian guy that hung around with deadheads for a while, but he ended up being basically captured by a crack dealing gang in Chicago because he had been sent there by one of his professors at the University of Chicago to go to low rent housing projects to just ask sort of like census questions for some research. And he ends up getting captured by a crack dealing gang, is nearly killed. What saves him is the gang leader, it turns out, was a graduate, I don't know what college, had worked in some, was it a business firm? Had worked with a business firm?
I don't remember this one.
But couldn't really make a living, so he turned to crack dealing. But what it turns out is that the crack dealing is apparently a pyramid scheme. But he likens it a lot to Hollywood, in where you've got a lot of people on the ground trying to get in, but as a result, they don't get paid squat. They actually break down how much a drug dealer makes, and it's just pathetic. But if you're in the upper echelon, if you're a gang leader on up to the sort of syndicate that ran all of the crack dealing gangs in Chicago, well, then you started breaking in anywhere from $50,000 to a couple $100,000 a year. And what's interesting is that you were like four times more likely to die as a crack dealer on the street, not one of the leaders. 4 times more likely to be killed than if you were on death row in Texas. There's a lot of the interesting numbers like that you brought out. What else you got?
That's pretty much all I had.
Okay.
Oh,
Go ahead.
chop chop, Dylan.
I'm just a.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Well, I've got the one book because unlike these guys, I really love fiction. I like Dungeons and Dragons, Forgotten Realms stuff. But this book has brought to my attention when I'm going to start name dropping again. Sorry. We were part of a fundraising drive for relief efforts in Japan back in March, about a week after the earthquake hit. And it was our podcast, along with the unofficial One Piece podcast, Konoha Corner, Mass Backwards Anime podcast, Manga podcast, I think Anime Expo Live was part of it. A bunch of people. We had all these different anime voice actors come on. We did sort of a 24-hour live stream on the internet. And we had all these different voice actors come on and sort of talk about their reactions to the earthquake and sort of how Japan has affected them because they were anime voice actors, video game voice actors. And one of them was somebody that we had recently done an interview with, someone that I've kind of built a little bit of a relationship through Facebook and talking with her online. And that was voice actress Jessica Straus. And she said her parents, she can trace her ancestry back to Nazi Germany and her family fleeing the Nazis and going to Japan for a little while. And then circumstances as things soured with Japan, they started becoming more involved in the war. They had to flee Japan as well and eventually came to America. But she said her uncle, Ulrich Straus, actually went back and interviewed a lot of the Japanese POWs during World War II. And it's something that he chronicles in this book, sort of their reactions to becoming POWs, becoming reacclimated to a society in Japan that didn't actually want them to come back alive, because there was an overwhelming edict of, there was nothing more shameful than being taken captive, and that's why there were relatively so few POWs from Japan in the war, but there were a number of them, and this book actually does an excellent job chronicling their experiences, as well as, I say this a number of times before I talk about the book. I really do feel like it should be mandatory reading in schools. Like if you teach a high school or college class about World War II when you're talking about Japan, you need to have people read this book, because it does something that I think a lot of other history classes fails to do, which is provide a very vivid and explicit insight to the Japanese motivation for entering World War II, attacking America in Pearl Harbor. Essentially, Japan felt that America would not really be able to respond well to a surprise attack, and that Japan would basically be able to outfight them with fighting spirit. I mean, that was kind of the idea, was that they would just overwhelm them with their ferocity, even though America outnumbered them. In a longer war, of course, we will be advantage. But they thought, a surprise attack, they wouldn't respond well, they wouldn't know how. And unfortunately, they realized, as many countries do, you don't piss off America.
You don't mess with Texas.
Right, yeah, you don't mess with Texas. And that was sort of their big miscalculation, was our actual ability to respond and endure the Japanese onslaught. There's also kind of a bomb thing that happened. Anyway, it's an extremely interesting book. It's kind of hard to find, although you can get it fairly easily on Amazon. I bought my copy from Borders back when there was still Borders. But it's one of those books that I feel like if you have any sort of appreciation for Japanese culture, anime, video games, anything like that, I think this is a book that you kind of need to read just to sort of bridge that gap from the country that fought us so ferociously during World War II to the country that is one of our strongest allies now. The English. I have not checked. I could probably pull out my phone and be that guy. This MSRP is for $24.95. I'm positive that you can get it on Amazon or someplace else for less.
It's fairly cheap, but it's not very expensive.
No, I mean, you can probably, if you look hard, you can probably find it for 20, maybe 15 bucks.
None of these books, I think, are really pricey.
I've heard like the Psychopath test. I've heard people, they had the author on the Daily Show. They had a lot of nonfiction writers on there. Daily Show. It was good to watch that.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I don't have the book with me, but there's a book I picked up at Dragon Con a couple years ago called Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks by Gilsdorf. And basically what it is, it's the story of a guy who's into D&D and things like that. And his teams grows out of the subculture, and then as an adult, he revisits it to see if there's something he's missed out. So, I mean, he's a journalist. It's kind of one of those books where, a journalist takes on some concept. Kind of like the Super Size Me thing. He visits J.R.R. Tolkien's hometown. He goes to several conventions, including Dragon Con, which I think is why it was advertised there when he was around. He participates in LARPs, SCA. He goes over to a place called, I think it's pronounced Levitt, France, where they're actually building a medieval castle with medieval methods. And I think there's at least 2 chapters on gaming and WoW. And what's interesting about the WoW chapters is he shows how it is helpful to people, how it is kind of empowering, and also how it can be addicting, so you get both sides of it. It's the kind of thing like after reading it, you just want to get involved in every fan of and if you like that Stranger in Strangeland style of writing, there's a couple other books I read. Daniel Radosh's Rapture Ready, Adventures in the Parallel Universe of Christian Pop Culture, A.J. Jacobs, The Year of Living Biblically, and Zach Parsons' Six Writing, or something off of Your Next Door Neighbor's a Dragon. Don't actually have it.
That's the book I kept thinking of when you were talking about the other ones. Wasn't that the one where he gets involved in like a furry subculture or something?
Yeah, the funny thing about the book is I think it's all based on interviews and real research he's done, but it's a completely fantastic storyline. And you can tell it because the intro is about him like wrangling his hand harder, and you can tell it's just really
So it's factual events presented in a
yes, there is a narrative.
Fictional narrative. Okay.
But what's great about all these books is they give voice to both proponents and the detractors for what they're talking about. And in the end, you feel the author has actually changed.
The Year of Living Biblically is a really good one. A.J. Jacobs.
He's done a couple other books.
Yeah, he's done several.
Beginning of Diaries. Beginning of Diaries.
There's one where he spent a year reading the entire Encyclopedia Britannica, which got segmented up. Well, it turned into a column for Mental Floss magazine. If any of you subscribe to that, that's an excellent, it's my favorite magazine. He did a column based on that where they would give him a letter of the outlet and he would rattle off as much as he could remember from that letter, from that volume of Encyclopedia Britannica. But the Year of Living Biblically, he spends an entire year trying to live by every single law in the Old Testament, I think.
He starts out, like most of his, like he kind of divides it up. As literally as possible.
Yeah, as literally as possible. And it was really interesting because it really does start to overwhelm him after a while.
Yeah, he doesn't, like, I think he comes from a Jewish background, but he is kind of agnostic, and you do see like, how this affects him. Kind of like the Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks. This is a guy who hasn't played D&D in a while, he hasn't been in that same culture. As the book goes on, you see that. I think that's really
So one that I finished recently, the Psychopath test. If you ever want to doubt your insanity, this is a really good book. Because, and this one's a really hard one to describe because I tend to read during lunch at work. So I look at people ask, oh, what's that about? And this one has been the hardest one to describe. It takes so many different directions.
It's a story about how he researches the subject. And so
Yeah.
it's not just about...
Oddly enough, the tagline for the journey through the madness industry is actually pretty apt. I kept trying to think of it in other terms, but that makes actually a lot of sense. It starts off with this really crazy story about this book that was happening in the early 2000s. These researchers started receiving this book in the mail. It was from Sweden, and it had a note on it that said, we'll talk about this when I get back. And then people start finding out that academics all over the world have received a copy of this book. And it's a really weird book. There are only so many pages. Half of them are blank, half of them have writing. Some that have writing have words cut out of them. Some have pictures. All the publication information has been taken out. But it's a really planned book. I mean, it's really, really expensive stock and all that stuff. And they couldn't find out, all these academics all over the world, most of them, like neuroscientists or psychiatrists, psychologists have received it, but also some like religion professors, professors of history, and they form an online community trying to figure out what the story behind the book is, what the meaning is. They figured it's some kind of puzzle, but if only they can figure out what the puzzle is, they'll come up with some sort of meaning. And they keep hitting brick walls with it, and they figure there's one piece of information they're just missing. So they get John Ronson, they figure they needed a private eye or a journalist. They need a journalist to try to look it up. And basically the short of it is they find out he finds this lead that the book that they think this book is sort of hinting at was translated into Swedish by a guy named Peter Nordlund. And he goes and tries to find this guy. And he's supposedly a psychologist, but when he finally meets him, he concludes that the guy himself is crazy.
Specifically a psychopath.
Well, no, I don't think I'm saying he's just crazy. And that's what gets him on this
But
journey.
the implication is the reason he did this was because he kind of has
This obsessive.
psychopathy.
I don't feel psychopathy. But he just, because they never say that. They say he's crazy. And that was the missing link. That was the thing that none of these academics could figure out, because they all assumed that whoever did this had to be exceptionally bright and have some kind of purpose in doing it. And it turns out there was no purpose. That was
It's
missing.
crazy.
Yeah,
You could have figured that out the first, when they first got the book. Really.
exactly. And then the rest of the book is him trying to figure out, well, basically the conclusion he comes to is, if one crazy person can affect the lives of so many otherwise completely rational people, then how else are crazy people basically defining how we live? How much control do crazy people have over us and our reactions? And in the process,
This is before the Republican debates.
yes. And he goes to a conference with the guy that developed the checklist that tests for psychopathy, and then tries to use it himself to figure out, well, are there psychopaths in, because there's the theory, the basic assumption is that 1% of the population is psychopath. And it has some, in some ways it's their amygdala, and they can't process empathy. So when they see like a gruesome crime scene, there's no gut reaction. There's just sort of intellectual interest in it. They are sort of incapable on some level of viewing it the same way we do. And that's what makes psychopaths dangerous, is that they can't empathize with other people.
They understand how to mimic.
Yes, I think it's really scary. Yeah, because he's talking about they tend to become really good mimics. Like they can see people expressing certain emotions, and that they may not be capable of, and they know something important is going on. They don't necessarily know what, but they can learn to emulate it so that they fit in.
How are they making a difference between psychopath and sociopath?
That actually comes up. They say that the word that the researchers that they were talking to use the word interchangeable.
And again, he's not a psychologist, so he's not, he's writing for me.
But that 1% is a big number.
Yeah, and the theory is that because what makes a psychopath also would make them very adept at either politics or business. And there's a theory, there's a sort of a theory, an untested theory, or semi just assumed theory, that you will find a higher number of psychopaths outside of that one. The people on Wall Street, the people in become CEOs, people become politicians, that it will be 1% of the psychopaths can be a larger percentage. That somehow their strengths actually play into those fields, because they also tend to be very charismatic. They tend to be able to put on a lot of charm, because, like one of the interviews, they do interviews with, he interviews a former Haitian death squad leader, Toto Constant, who would have been sent back to Haiti for war crimes had he not said he was going to reveal who in America had been funding his death squad. And suddenly he gets to live in New York for the rest of his life.
With his mom. Right?
Yes, with his mom. And he has an enormous collection of Burger King kids' meal toys. But one of the interviews that he has with him, the guy, Toto Constant, says, it really hurts my feet. It really hurts me when people don't like me. I like to be liked. And he keeps asking about this and says, well, why do you want to be liked? And he actually comes out and says, well, I want people to like me because then I can control them. He's like, oh, so what you mean is not that your feelings are hurt people don't like you, that your status is hurt. Oh, yeah, that's what I mean. And he also interviews, he talks to Scientologists to try to build up, because they have a whole organization that's based on saying that psychiatry is a fraud. So he figures if anybody has stories about psychiatry who overstep their bounds, it would be them. So he interacts with them. We talk to some people that are, talk to one guy that's been maybe locked up, wasn't a psychopath, was playing crazy to get out of a prison term. And then it goes further to, he talks to late produced reality television to see what kind, how they were looking for people that were crazy but not too crazy. And then it goes from there. So it starts off about Psychopath, but then comes about just sort of madness in general, and how our society, basically how we are defined by our most obsessive fringe beliefs. How any of us sort of get defined by those. So it kind of comes to the conclusion that maybe it's sort of a spectrum. There's not just a crazy, not crazy, but there's actually a spectrum in between where people fall, and people get defined by those sort of rougher histories. This is a really good one. And this is about the same guy that did The Men Who Stared at Goats and Them. Which I haven't read.
He did.
Not the Them you're thinking. The one with Roddy Piper. Is that Them?
I'm thinking of a different Them.
Okay.
Not Them, but Them.
Yeah, Them.
By the way, just for fun, I've not read that book at all. I turned the page just like randomly. It was the guy who brings people and lights out their devils.
Yep. And there's one other
The
guy.
Asian guy, was it?
I don't think so.
There's one other one of the interesting bits on how he sort of shows what a psychopath is capable of. They talk about a researcher who was interviewing a known psychopath who was in prison, and would show them pictures of people expressing different emotions, and would ask the guy, "Can you tell me what emotion this expresses?" And he was showing the guy pictures of people expressing fear, and said, "Do you know what emotion this is?" And the guy's response was, "No, but that's the face people pull when I'm killing them." Go.
Okay. American Nerd, The Story of My People by Benjamin Nugent. This is one I actually picked up just scouring through Borders when they were doing their closeout sales.
Liquidations, everything was go.
Yeah. And it's more serious than you would expect from the title. Basically, the first half is actually a discussion of the nerd culture, and he seems to use a definition that is more behavioral rather than culture. Nerds want to avoid conflict. They are technically apt in certain areas, but not certain areas.
But he talks about two different kinds of nerds.
Yes, he talks about
The one group that's sort of the more behavioral nerd, in the sense he basically likens them sort of to machines. Like they don't do social interaction well, but they're more, they get along better with machines than they do people, basically. And they're sort of defined by sort of almost machine robotic tendencies.
he talks about, I think, Brian Wilson.
Yeah. And then the second group are the ones that are called nerds just because they have been excluded by everyone else.
And both of those, I think, figure into that behavioral rather than, it's not like you're a fan of something, therefore. And I thought that was interesting because those things, terms like geek and nerd seem to attach themselves to certain subcultures. Yeah, that's fine, but I think there's also a different, non-mainstream way of thinking that should go along with that. And it doesn't always, so there's always it's an interesting exploration of that side.
Well, that and complete change because I'm just going to in here because I've read the book.
That's
As far as the term nerd and geek, Geek Media Expo,
yes.
it's become more of an umbrella term than it was when we were growing up in the 80s and 90s.
Yes. And he kind of narrows it down.
Yeah, a nerd can be a broader type of personality now than it could be 20 years ago.
That's kind of what I was getting. What's interesting is he connects the evolution of the term to racial, literary, and cultural elements in the early 20th century, as well as things like Asperger's and how those overlap with the quality sequences. I think he does discuss that. I think it's autism in general, but I think he specifically does. I can't remember that. There's actually a chart where he goes over like here's kind of the stereotype of the nerd, here's autism. Actually does. what's interesting is he also ties it to racism in the early 20th century. There are certain races, Jews and Asians, the racism that existed then is kind of a precursor to what we think of as nerds now. Yeah.
Yeah, he does an interesting continuum combining two different forms of racism that were sort of prevalent, which was, and white people obviously were right in the middle of it if you combine the two, because they would have been on the good side of either one. But it was, one was the spectrum of who's more logical and who's more animal, mechanical. And that, mechanical and animal, and, well, logical makes more sense on the first one, because
I think that
white people would be at the very logical end, and then in this was an early 20th century spectrum. The animal end, as you got darker skin, you became more animal, and you cared more about feeling than logic. Then he combined that with another sort of racist continuum, in which case there were people that were more feeling and more machine-like, in which case, in that case, probably more on the feeling side, but the cold machine-like people were the Asians. And there was a spectrum, like Arabic people fit the middle, so he combines the two spectrums and said, which was sort of white people in the middle, sort of black people on the animal end, and Asians on the mechanical end, and said the nerds, if you were subscribed to these sort of forms of racism, nerds kind of fit into the spectrum on the machine side between white people and Asians.
What's interesting is it's there's clearly that spectrum that exists, and nerd and jock fit on the same spectrum. So it's kind of like, what I found interesting about his conclusion was this sort of divisiveness and dehumanization is not something that can be known along racial or cultural lines or even gender lines. Any sort of group. And it almost seems like if certain targets no longer become, safe targets, then people will find
Society moves on to other directions.
yeah, they'll find a less obvious way of again. The cultural element is also interesting because he thinks a lot of it comes from a movement called
Muscular Christianity.
Which was early 1900s.
That's Teddy Roosevelt, right?
Yes, it was where the Boy Scouts came from. It was basically a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and things like this, where those physical skills were no longer necessary. Physical and kind of survival skills were no longer necessary. So
That became how you kept your identity.
right, and people wanted to reintroduce that into culture so that America didn't.
And that started in England and then came over here, and then that's where you have Teddy Roosevelt and a bunch of those, the outdoors.
And he kind of suggests that maybe that's where the idea that physical prowess is good and intellectualism is bad kind of comes from. The second half of the book is more a case study where he touches on different groups. And it's really interesting because I almost stopped reading at this point because his first case study is about a high school debate team. And everything he's defined up to this point about geeks or nerds avoiding emotional or physical confrontation and not preferring or not understanding non-rational, non-verbal forms of communication. He kind of pulls a 180 on because the high school debate team understands that two people having a conversation, there is perhaps more going on than just the information being exchanged. So it's interesting, and he even tells kind of his story in one of these chapters. And I think it gives a good cross-section or swath of kind of what the nerd concept is. And its definitions are very rich in a lot of different groups. It's a really good book.
I got one I go through really quickly.
Okay.
I actually bought this for a friend for Christmas, so if we ever do this panel again, we need to talk about it now because I won't have it. But I got it for her because she's an alcoholic. So I got
This
it
is
for
my
this
sister, by the way.
Yeah, it's his sister.
He's one of the
And I read this just because I bought it for her for Christmas. Like, I'm going to take a look. I don't need to drink, but I found it interesting. If you're into alcohol, this is actually a really good one. This guy is a reporter. Well, he's a journalist for a spirits column of a major newspaper. I don't remember which one. And basically, this is sort of a travel log. Also, sort of reviews of different alcohols. There's also recipes. And when he's in search, and actually the subtitle, On the Trail of the Rare, the Obscure, and the Overrated in Spirits, sort of covers it pretty well. He's disenchanted sort of with American alcohol culture because so much was destroyed during the Prohibition and then fell out of fashion and either never came back, or once it came back, never really gained much of a toehold in America anymore. So a lot of the spirits he talks about are European or South American. He goes over stuff that he feels that the American palate doesn't necessarily care for, because what they care for in drinks are tend to be sweet things where you don't really taste the alcohol. And he's also against sort of shot culture. He spends a lot of time on stuff that you sip, digestives or aperitifs. Stuff, and he goes to a lot of places where the stuff is made. So he covers French apple brandy, Calvados, cognac, eau de vie, Pisca.
Like German ale?
No, mostly it's just the hard stuff. He pretty much spends no time on beer or wine. He's only talking about the hard stuff. And there's a lot of, little interesting tidbits in here. Bits that were forgotten. In one particular bit, he's talking about a spirit called creme de violet that is distilled from these two different flowers grown in the French Alps. And then there's a cocktail called the Aviator, and for years no one knew what was called the Aviator. The texts on the drinks kind of authoritative things would say, they had no idea what it was called. What they didn't realize is the earliest recipe had creme de violet in it, which turned the drink bright blue, and suddenly it made perfect sense. If the drink is sky blue, why it's called the Aviator? Because it makes complete sense. So he covers little things like that. It's kind of interesting. He counts as kind of a jerk because he gets into these distilleries where there's a lot of sort of myth around like spiritual chartreuse, which has been around for hundreds of years. The recipe is only known by 2 Carthusian monks. Each one only knows half the recipe, and both have taken a vow of silence. Which that I think comes across as being fairly much the case. But a lot of stuff is like, they have these stories about, oh, this is how ancient this spirit is, and this is how it's made. And you come to find out, no, not really. That's all just sort of marketing that's grown up over, American cities has been around, well over 100 years, 200-300 years.
Basically, it's urban.
Basically, yeah, and then it's become marketing as it became a bigger industry for them, so people have made it. So this one's just kind of fun for some of the history. And again, I don't drink and still found this, but then again, I can find just about anything interesting to some extent or another. But it's a fun one if you want to know more about if you do drink, if you do enjoy spirits, and you want to find out stuff you probably didn't know, you want to expand what you know, because if you consider yourself kind of an amateur. I thought this was pretty good.
Okay. Next one I have is The Sacredness of Questioning Everything.
I got that.
David Miller. Yes. I think he actually lives in Nashville, which is interesting. And it's kind of a look at both mainstream American culture and evangelical subculture from a fresh perspective. He does come from a religious background.
His grandfather was a preacher, I believe.
Yeah, actually.
His grandfather was a very fundamentalist evangelical preacher. But I think this is in the beginning of the book. What was it when he was getting really up in years? Told David that that he had lived his life as well he could by the rules he had. But he said, if you ever find out that anything I believe is wrong, you can get rid of it and carry on. That was basically, it's don't, the idea being, if I thought I was living my life the best I could, but if you find out that something I did just doesn't mesh with what you think God wants, then feel free to scrap it. Because this worked for me, and it may not work for you.
He's actually, he's kind of, I would say left of center, but he's a religious writer, and it's published by Zombie.
When I started reading it, there's a lot of stuff like, okay, the basic premise, I'm like, yeah, okay, I already thought this, but he had a lot of interesting tales, especially toward the latter part of the book.
He's definitely an author that, and I like reading a lot of books like that he'll take something that I've kind of thought about, haven't halfway fleshed it out, and just but it's more of a philosophical. And it's really more, for me, it was more like a mental exercise because he tends to go over the same points from a lot of different perspectives. It's not something to take notes on.
And the basic point of the book is that God has no problem with you questioning. That's why He gave you the mind that you have. That you're not going to offend God by asking a question.
But even more so, he talks about not just religion, questioning emotions, questioning media, questioning language, history, government, the future. He's got a chapter for basically a whole bunch of different concepts. The one I like, and the one that actually got me to buy this book, because I saw a reference to a blog post, is talking about unoffendedness and kind of the American culture of being offended, which is, he differentiates from anger. Is,
He talks a lot about the culture of offendedness in America.
Yes, which is, that alone is worth it.
Yeah, which, basically he's talking about how being offended allows you to shut down and not have to interact with someone. That you can keep whatever view you already had just by being offended.
It's more about our own comfort rather than justice.
Yeah, and he's talking about how that's something you gotta try to avoid, or you will shut down any kind of dialogue.
Especially, and one reason I think this is very much a geek book is he has a interesting way of deconstructing pop culture. It's not exactly what I would think of. You read a story, you watch a movie, and you think about it in terms of the whole movie. What's the author's perspective? And he'll pick out a particular song, or he'll pick out a particular character and run with it. And it's overall, it's actually more optimistic than you would be if you looked at the entire world.
There's a really good example. When he opens the book, is with a story about Uncle Ben, or one of those opens the book. Yeah. And he says, imagine you visit this town. It's this really classic place, and you start hearing people say stuff like, the weather's really nice. Man, thanks to Uncle Ben for that, and stuff like that. He says, and then once a week they go to somebody's house, and then they're all sort of mingling about, having drinks or snacks. And then this bell chimes, and everybody goes downstairs to the basement. And there's this really gruff-looking man who's standing next to a furnace and says, if you don't do everything that I say, you're going to end up in here. And points to the furnace. You can't see anything inside it, but you can hear screaming. And he says that's how a lot of Americans end up encountering God. That's how they end up seeing God, is as this sort of Uncle Ben figure who. He's laid down these rules, and heaven help you if you question a single one of them. And so that was an interesting example. I thought it's kind of, if you do have that opinion and you hear the story, and then at the end you say, well, this is the people who view God.
It reframes kind of what you.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a lot of what his book is. The interesting thing about the pop culture aspect, like, you will either love this book or you will think he's a little bit off. Because there's this 2 or 3 page discussion of Arcade Fire. He takes some lyrics from Beck. If there's a man who owns a rhyming dictionary, I believe it was this man.
It's probably David Dark.
He
owns the rhyming dictionary.
He takes some Beck lyrics and he applies that to a philosophical concept.
And he's pretty wordy, but he's an English professor or an English teacher at an Episcopal private high school somewhere, I think, in the Nashville area.
I don't know if he's still. I know
He may not be doing that anymore. I know when
because I saw something on Twitter.
in the writing of that though, he was still because he occasionally talks about his students' reactions to certain topics. And the book's really cool because it actually has the end of every chapter are discussion questions. So the book is actually framed so that you can use it in sort of a book group, classroom, church group.
What's interesting, he talks about, like, he also references, like, The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, MST3K, so...
And actually,
I was
following
about to
up
say
on
that.
that is his other book, the book he wrote after this, Everyday
No, it was
Law.
actually before.
Was this?
Like, this is his latest.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
This is just taking on the pop culture stuff, elements that we find in Sacredness and everything. And he's basically taking pop culture and trying to find the sacredness. And when he talks about apocalypse, he doesn't mean what we traditionally consider apocalypse. He means
The giant purple chick from X-Men.
Yes.
Or what happened yesterday.
Yeah, Apocalypse is a woman. That's weird.
Anyway, but no, what he's talking about apocalypse is the idea, sort of more biblical idea of the apocalypse in that God makes everything new again. And what he talks about is that he considers it sort of an ongoing process.
Sort of revelation revealing.
Yeah,
which is what
that revelation is always happening, and you can find it in a lot of places. And one of the places he looks is pop culture. And he talks about Flannery O'Connor, about Simpsons, Radiohead, who else? The movies of the Coen brothers.
I have actually bought movies and books and CDs just because you mentioned it. I'm trying to, like, I don't know, it's stuff I wouldn't have watched otherwise.
And what's cool, I think he takes, I found a lot of similarity between his writing and a friend of mine who is a preacher who thinks that George Carlin was a prophet. In the Old Testament sense, of a person that can point out what's wrong with society and why it's wrong, and sort of let people try to bring that to people's attention, and stuff that they might ignore.
He's coming, look busy.
Yes.
I don't have that.
More than for Amtrak, for Sunday.
Yeah. Yes.
I think it's going to be there this year.
But and actually, this is something that's come up in a lot of the. Well, I'll just read you this a little bit. It's just from an interview that Tom York of Radiohead did for the New Music Express. Three legs are, and I think that this sort of crystallizes why I really like this book. I read some journalist recently lecturing the anti-globalization lobby saying, this is the way capitalism works. All capitalism is exploitation, and to make it try and do something else, it's never going to happen. And it's like, yeah, but where does that leave us? This is somehow God's will, all this. It's God's will that we sit in traffic. It's God's will that millions of people are going to die this year because of some outmoded economic policies. No, it's not. It's like some deranged sacrificial altar, the high priests of the global economy holding up these millions of children each year like, we wish to please you, O gods of free trade. If there is a devil at work, then it rests in institutions and not in individuals. Because the beauty of institutions is that any individual can abdicate responsibility. The assumption is that we're all utterly powerless. That's the devil. And to me, that's sort of what makes this book awesome.
I was about to say, we got about 10 minutes before the next panel starts, so we do have a few moments if Charlie, if you have anything else to talk about, to take any questions or comments.
Yeah, any questions? If not, we can keep talking. Keep talking? Okay. Fair enough.
Mr.
I didn't. There are two books I did not bring, but wish I could have found them. How We Decide by Jonah Lehrer. And a good follow-up that one is Sway, Irresistible Irrational Behavior by Corey and Ron Rothman.
And I would actually add in, because I grouped those together with Malcolm Gladwell's book. They're all kind of the same.
And they cover very similar issues, but they take sort of different, they have sort of somewhat different takes, or it's like somewhat different focuses.
Okay.
Anyway, How to Decide is basically a very straight, and he's really good at giving examples of how people make decisions, both consciously and unconsciously. There's some really cool stuff about, like one of the opening stories is about during the Operation Desert Storm, there was a guy on an aircraft carrier whose job was to monitor the radar. And he sees a blip come in. He has only a few seconds to decide whether it's a Scud missile or it's a returning fighter jet. The problem is that because of anti-aircraft fire, the jets were on radio silence. So they wouldn't, there was no point in even radioing them to find out. I think he tried, but they didn't come back because of radio silence. So he only had a few seconds to decide, well, do I launch a missile at this thing, either possibly saving the aircraft carrier or killing the pilot? And he's watching it, and at the last second decides to fire the missile. And it turns out it was a Scud missile. But he was put on administrative leave because they couldn't figure out how he knew. The analysis was that there's no way he could have known, there's no way he could have made that decision. He was just taking a chance that it was a missile and not a fighter jet. But it turns out a neuroscientist was interested in the story. And what it turns out was that a jet and a Scud missile travel at different altitudes. And there was an almost imperceptible difference in the radar blip because of the altitude. And what the neuroscientist concluded was that some part of his brain, because he had spent so much time watching the radar and deciphering what meant what, that some part of his brain had become attuned, had been able to spot that minute difference, that if you were just watching it rationally, you could not have noticed. And then from there, I think pretty much every chapter begins with sort of the story of, this is sort of what he's going to be talking about. Here's a story that illustrates it. And there's some really cool stories in it. And then in Sway, Corey and Ron Rothman sort of take part of that and talk about some of the same stuff and talk about how irrational behavior can govern our decision making, whether we understand it or not. A story from that is there's a guy in Silicon Valley that starts this biotech company. He ends up getting bought by a larger company. He gets besides a decent buyout package, stock in the parent company that rockets up. And he's waiting so he can basically buy a house, a boat, and something else as a retirement. He's trying to add enough money to live as his retirement, live a really nice living. And he's talking to this financial advisor, and the stock had dipped a little bit. And the guy's like, and the advisor says, well, I think you should go ahead and sell this. And the guy's like, well, no, I just want to if you can go back up to this, he was looking for this magic number that the stock price would be. And it started out here, and it didn't even here, it actually fell back. If I can just get back to this point, I'll sell. It'll be fine. If I can just make this point. And then it dropped more, and he's talking to the financial advisor again. And the guy's like, well, no, if you can just get back to this point, then I'll sell. And it keeps going until it basically wipes out his entire retirement. And they use that to talk about the idea of loss aversion, that you will take very great risks to avoid feeling that the human brain gets a smaller high out of a gain than it does the loss than it does the negative feeling of a loss. So a similar amount of gain and loss, you're going to overreact to the loss more often than not. More often than you will react. You react appropriately to the gain, overreact to the loss. They also talk. This is a great one, and one day I want to do this at a panel. So don't tell anybody. If you ever do this, don't spill the beans. There's a professor, I think it's at MIT of economics, and there's one class that begins every class with an auction. He auctions a $20 bill. The only rules are bids start at $1 and proceed in $1 increments. The only other rules, high bidder pays whatever high bid was for the $20 bill. The second highest bidder has to pay whatever they bid, but gets nothing. And he said it's always fun to watch how this goes, because it'll be fast and furious up until about 10, 13 bucks, and then it'll start trailing off until you have 2 people left. And inevitably someone hits 20 bucks. But loss aversion makes the person who's going to pay 19 and get nothing say, well, I may as well bid 21, so at least I can offset my losses. He said, in the highest bid he's ever received was over $200 for a 20 And he said, in all the years he has done this auction, he's never once lost money on it. So don't tell anybody about that if we do this again, because I really want to actually try that one. And then Blink is sort of about quick response, unconscious decision making, decisions that we can't possibly have made consciously because our conscious brain works so much slower than our unconscious brain. And this is stuff that Hal Insight works on too, is how many pieces of information our brain can process unconsciously, because that's how we evolved, is to be able to take in a whole lot of stuff to keep ourselves safe. And then the irrational brain evolves later.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap this up. Please check us out, chainsawbuffet.com. We're also on Twitter, at chainsawbuffet, and Facebook, facebook.com/chainsawbuffet.
And we'll try to put up a list of all these books if we remember which ones we talked about.
And one last book I remembered, I should have thought to bring it with me, but if you want a book that'll actually help you in a lot of aspects of your life that you never thought it would, read The Art of War.
Oh, yeah.
Chainsaw Buffet a national?
I'm sorry?
Is it a national?
It's technically not still. We are fairly local.
Localish.
We come to Intact and GMX every year though, so.